Okay, so we had user Christian Van Wyk, I believe, 3863 ask or state, I need to know how to call stored procedures from VBA in Microsoft Access. Great question. I'm here to help. Hopefully, my name's Jeremy. This is Great Office Tutorial Ever. If you like, please subscribe, like. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to jump over to the monitor here, and what I have done in Access is I have set up 2 blank forms, and then I'm looking at the VBA editor over here. Now, we have to ask ourselves some questions when we are going through this on how to call things, and the first one is pretty essential, is it public or private? So when we're trying to call code, are we trying to call a public sub or a private sub? Now, what are the differences? So let's look at this. So I'm going to go to my VBA editor over here, and I'm going to go to my database, and I'm going to create a new module. Now, this would work the same in Excel. You would just go to the Excel editor, module, not class module, module. Class modules, super advanced. Okay. Now let's do something called public sub double M. And all it's going to do is give us a message box of hello world. Now, this is a public sub. We'll save it as module 1. Now, on this button for form 1, I can attach calling this sub mm from multiple events. And now typically you would want to call it from the on-click event of this button. So I go to the event for that button. I go to the on-click, I do the triple dots, and then I do code builder. Okay, so now we're in the code that belongs to that button that is part of form 1. Now you'll notice up here in my navigator, it has a form 1 entry. I can just call the code just like this, mm. And that's it, because that's the name of the sub, mm. So now let's look at our form. If I click the button, hello world. Pretty simple. Now, what if, so that's a public sub. Notice it's public. What if I try to do something like this? What if I'm in form 1, so this is form 1's code, and I know it's kind of scrunched here. There we go. That's module 1. This is form 1. So behind this form, I can make a private module, or a private sub. Oh, I guess I need to give it a name. mm2. There we go. Okay, now let's clarify what we're doing here. This is the code behind the event of the on-click button, or the on-click event of this button. So command 0_click is an event. Here is just a private sub that is located within the form 1's backend code. So you can have code that is part of a form that's not really attached to any kind of event. It's just a private sub. Now, what's the difference between public and private? So here we go. Let's say I go, now this is form 1 at the bottom. Let's say I go to form 2's code, and I go to the button, on-click event, code builder. Okay, now I'm looking at form 2, and I try to call mm2, which is a private sub. Save. Let's go to form 2, sub or function not defined. That's because mm2 is part of form 1's code. It's private. So an object outside of form 1, which would be form 2, cannot see that code. Even if it's a subform or something like that, they are completely different objects. And so you can have code that is private to an object, and sometimes you need to do that. So if you have very complex code, because it's a complex form, sometimes you'll keep that code local to that form. And that guarantees no other object in the database can call that code. So that answers kind of question 1, which is you need to consider, is it public or private? Because if it's a private piece of code and you're trying to call it from outside the object that contains that, it's not going to work. So let's assume for now that we are just going to work with public code. So here's form 1. So let's get rid of this private sub here. We still have the code for the on click run Okay, let's get out of our break condition here. So this is form 2. It failed. So form 2 can also call because is a public module 1 So now if I try to run this, save, hello world. They both have access, both forms have access, to the code, which is right here, because it's public, which means anything can call it. Now, that out of the way, what is the next thing we need to consider? We need to consider whether sorry, I'm typing here. Is it a sub? Is it a sub or function? So is it a sub or a function? You don't have to do the big N. There we go. Now the reason we want to consider that is whether we're expecting the procedure we call to return a value. So for instance, if I'm on, tell you what, let's rearrange these. So this is form 1's code at the very top, and this is form 2's code. And this is module 1. Kind of cramped here. This is a low-res monitor, but I have to keep it big so you guys can see it. Okay, form 1 code, form 2 code, module 1. Now, if I'm expecting the procedure to return something, that's called a function. So let's do another thing in here. In our public code called, in our module 1 called public function RDBL, which means return double. And I'm going to pass it, and RDBL equals pval times 2. So I have to pass it a long integer, and R double is a long integer. So that's the value of R double is a long integer, and it accepts a long integer. So the first thing you have to consider is it a function or a procedure, and then do I also have to pass it argument? So I'm kind of doing 2 at once. So let's go up to our form 1 code, and instead of running when we click that button, I'm going to message box the value of 4dbl equals, and then I'm going to append, and then I can call that function right in the middle of the string. So rdbl, I'm going to pass it the number 4. I know this is very rudimentary, but you'll see what happens. So when I click this, the value of 4 double equals 8. So what I did was in form 1's code on the on-click event for this button, I just threw up a message box that says the value of 4 double equals, and then I call that function. I'm expecting a value to be returned from that function. I call it and I pass it the appropriate argument, which is 4. Now sometimes arguments are required and sometimes they're optional. So it's very important to know that distinction. So if I were to do this, optional pval as long, what do you think R double will return if I don't pass it an argument? So now watch this. When I come up here, notice that pval is in brackets, which usually means it's optional, although sometimes there are mistakes in the helper text for functions. So what if I do this? What if I just call R double? What do you think happens? The value of 4 double equals 0, because by default, if I do not pass a value to this function, Access will default it to certain things. So for instance, a long will default to 0. A Boolean will default to false. A date, I think, defaults to January 1st, 1900, or maybe 1899, I'm not sure. Something weird, December 31st, 1899. So if you do not pass an optional, a string will default to just double quote, which is a blank. It's not the same as null. So you have to know whether you're expecting a value to come from that thing, and does it require arguments or not? Another thing you have to consider when you're calling a sub is it part of a library that is not within Access? So for instance, let me close these up so we can kind of see. I think we're kind of done there. I'm going to test, let's pretend I'm in Access and I want to call on the Excel library. So if I'm trying to call a function or a sub that's not part of the base Access code, I have to refer to that library. So watch this. I'm going to dim ws as excel.worksheet. That doesn't exist. I don't get any helper text, and a matter of fact, it's going to error out. User defined type not defined. Access thinks this is a user defined type, which would be a class module completely different than what we're doing here. Okay, so what it means is it's not recognizing that object basically. So what I have to do is I have to make sure I have the appropriate library reference. In this case, I would open my tools, references. I would go to Microsoft Excel, something or another, right here. Now, when I do this, dim ws as Excel, oh, you note, see, as I started typing, it has the library icon. That means I've included the Excel library in my Access project, excel.worksheet. Now I have functions to all the Excel library objects. So I can run Excel functions from within Access. And I know you asked about Access, but a lot of times people do work between Access and Excel, back and forth. And so you have to be aware of, sometimes you have to add the library or any other thing. Sometimes you have to add scripting library. It just depends on what you're trying to call. If it's not part of the baseline Access library, you have to refer to it in your references. You just put the checkbox, and there are a ton of them. I've only used a few of them, probably 6 or 7 different ones. The next thing so let's go back to our stuff. Is it a sub or a function? Does it require arguments? Is it part of another library? Oh, and Excel versus Access isms. Again, this is for the both Access and Excel people here, because we're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Here, I'll show you kind of what I mean by that. So let's get rid of this. For some reason in Excel, and I don't really see this a lot in Access, for some reason when you're calling a function in Excel, sometimes you'll need to refer to the name of the argument as well as its value. So for example, I don't have a real example queued up. You'll just have to pretend. Let's pretend this is Excel. And they had a function called something like, I don't know, make bold. And they had arguments you had to pass to make bold. Bold was maybe a function as Boolean, color as long. Sometimes when you're calling this in Excel, you would have to do something like this. You would have to do make bold. Then you have to set the object, or sorry, refer to the argument's name, bold : equals true, color : equals 255, which is red, which is the long value for red. That's how it would be called in Excel. It doesn't seem to be consistent. Sometimes you don't have to do this, sometimes you do. You have to refer to the name of the argument when you call the function or the sub. In Access, you typically don't need to do that. I can't recall of one that do that. So if this was an Access instead of an Excel function, you would just do this, make bold true 255. That's how you would call that in Access. Typically, I can't think of a native Access function or sub that actually requires the argument name in the call. Excel, it's hit or miss. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you can get away with it. And that's something you need to be aware of, again, if you're in Access, but you're reaching out to do things in Excel, which I do all the time. In my Access databases for my job, Excel makes amazing reports for certain types of reports that Access just can't do. So that's another thing you have to be aware of. So I think that's it. I think we've covered everything we need to. So again, make sure the sub or the procedure basically you're trying to call, is it public or private? So realize you can only call private subs from within the object where that private sub is located. Is it a sub or a function? Are you expecting return results if it's a function? Do you have to pass the sub arguments or the procedure arguments, whether it's a sub or a function? They can both be passed arguments. Are those arguments optional or are they required? Is it part of another library? Maybe you need to refer to your other library. And is it Excel versus Access? Oh, one more thing. I don't know if I showed you, so we'll go real quick. You can call code from within other code. Did I do that already? So for instance, if this is my module 1, public sub rdbl2. What I'm going to do is dim I as long I equals 10. I can call rdbl from within code. I do it all the time, actually. So rdbl so I can do message box. So from within the public sub rdbl2, I'm calling the function rdbl. I'm passing it a value of I. And then now when I run this, again, I could attach rdbl2 to an event. I could just run it from my immediate window down here to test it out, which you should always be running your immediate window. There we go, 20. One more thing. So I hope this helped. If you found this useful, please consider subscribing, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Thanks. God bless.